Story 1. My best friend and his father were in a car accident 5 years ago when we were both 16. His dad didn't survive, and my friend ended up in a coma for 12 weeks. I spent a lot of time at the hospital and at his house, trying to support his family however I could. His mother was struggling more than anyone. A few weeks after the accident, she had an emotional breakdown while driving me home from the hospital. She told me she couldn't be alone that night and begged me to stay for a while. I agreed, not wanting to leave her in that state. We went back to the house and she poured me a glass of wine, trying to ease the overwhelming grief she was feeling. That night changed everything between us. She was lonely, lost, and looking for comfort, and I was too young to fully understand the weight of it all. It was something that should never have happened, but it did, and it didn't stop there. In the weeks that followed, she sought me out whenever the pain became too much, and I never turned her away. Everything changed when my friend finally woke up. The moment he was released from the hospital, it was like an unspoken agreement between us. We kept our distance, avoiding each other as if nothing had ever happened. To this day we never talk about it. Story 2. When we were 10, my best friend and I were constantly bullied by a kid who lived in our complex. He was the worst kind of bully, the type who acted perfectly sweet around adults but turned into a nightmare when no one was watching. One day, after he pinned my friend down and forced him to eat something disgusting off the ground, we decided we'd had enough. We wanted to make sure he never did anything like that again. We grabbed an empty cleaning bottle, filled it with a mix of household chemicals, and went looking for him. When we found him, he smirked and asked my friend if he was still hungry, making it clear he had no regrets. The second he stepped closer, I squeezed the bottle and sprayed him right in the face. Once, twice, 3 times just to be sure. He ended up in the hospital with chemical burns and lost vision in one eye, with partial blindness in the other. For years we never heard from him. But then, out of nowhere, he messaged me on Facebook. Instead of anger, he sent an apology. He admitted to how horribly he had treated us and, to my surprise, even thanked me for what happened. He called it a real eye-opener. His words, not mine. Now, he works exclusively with blind children and says it's the most fulfilling thing he's ever done. Story 3. I grew up poor in a dysfunctional household in a rural area. My parents struggled and my siblings and I often went hungry. As the oldest, I tried my best to take care of them, but one day I failed in the worst way. When I was 7 and my little brother was 5, he came up to me holding a sandwich he had managed to put together from whatever scraps were in the kitchen. It was just one slice of bologna between 2 squished, dried-out pieces of bread. No cheese, no condiments, nothing extra. But to us, it was something. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe just a childish tantrum, but I knocked it right out of his little hands onto the dirt. He immediately burst into tears and bent down to pick it up, desperate to salvage what little he had. Before he could, a group of scrappy neighborhood dogs rushed in, knocking him over and devouring it before his eyes. He just lay there in the dirt, crying, covered in dust, repeating over and over, "I made it to share with you." I'm 30 now and we have a close relationship, but I still think about that moment every single day. I don't know if he remembers it, and honestly, I hope he doesn't. But I do, and I don't think I'll ever forgive myself. Story 4. It was a Friday night, sometime around midnight, when I was walking downtown after leaving the bar. I had parked a few blocks away since city parking is a nightmare on weekends. About halfway to my car, when the streets had emptied out, someone came up behind me, tapped my shoulder, and told me to hand over my wallet, or as he put it, "It will be bad." His hand was shoved deep in his pocket, and I didn't know if he had a gun or a knife. All I could think about was getting stabbed or shot, and I really didn't want that to happen. Before he could make a move, I reached for my wallet, but instead, I grabbed the knife I always carried. Without thinking, I shoved my hand into his face and stabbed him in the stomach. Once, twice, 3 times. Then I ran as hard and as fast as I could for what felt like a mile, maybe more. I never looked back, never told anyone, never called the cops. It felt like doing that would only put me in a worse position. I have no idea what happened to him, and I don't think I ever want to know. Story 5. I was 11 years old when it happened. My grandmother, who was raising me, was out running errands. I asked her to bring me an Oreo McFlurry from Dairy Queen. She said no, it was out of her way. I kept asking, hoping to change her mind, but she refused. About 2 hours later, she came home. Instead of pulling into the driveway, she stopped at the end of it and just sat there for a while. It was strange, like she was considering leaving again. Curious, I went outside to see what was going on. When I walked up to the car, she rolled down the window and handed me an Oreo McFlurry. She had the biggest smile on her face, happy that she had surprised me. But instead of being grateful, I was still upset that she had said no earlier. Without thinking, I took it and threw it down onto the lawn. I remember the way her smile instantly faded, the confusion and hurt on her face as she stared at me. She passed away from cancer a year later. I'm 24 now and that moment still haunts me. She had already raised her own kids, yet she chose to raise me too. She was the best person I've ever known, and I hate that when I think of her, this is the first memory that comes to mind. Story 6. In high school, my friends and I used to play this ridiculous game we called wall run. The goal was simple. Sprint as fast as you could toward the school building, jump, and see how high you could leave a mark on the wall. The winner would brag about their athleticism for the rest of the day. One day we were hanging out in the parking lot after hours, and I had this bright idea to take wall run to the next level. I climbed onto a dumpster to get a running start, intending to leap higher than anyone ever had. My friends egged me on, laughing and cheering as I geared up for my big moment. But as soon as I leapt off the dumpster, I knew something was wrong. My foot hit the wall weirdly and I slipped midair, landing directly on my back. The impact knocked the wind out of me and for a terrifying moment I couldn't breathe or move. My friends freaked out, thinking I was seriously hurt. Thankfully, after a few minutes, I managed to get up and walk it off. Now, whenever I hear people talk about high school memories, all I can think about is how close I came to ending up in a wheelchair, or worse, over something so stupid. Story 7. When I was 22, I was living with my boyfriend in a tiny one-bedroom apartment. He was working 2 jobs to support us while I went to school. Money was always tight and we were both constantly stressed. One night, I was sitting on the couch when I noticed his laptop was still open. Out of curiosity, I clicked through some tabs he'd left open and stumbled across something I wasn't supposed to see. An email thread between him and another woman. They weren't just talking, they were making plans to meet up. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I spent the next week quietly gathering evidence, reading his messages whenever he wasn't looking, and piecing together the whole story. It turned out they had been seeing each other for months. When I finally confronted him, he didn't deny it. He just stared at me and said, "What do you expect? You're never around and I'm always working." I packed my things and left the same night. Looking back, I know I wasn't perfect in that relationship, but I still can't shake the feeling that I should have seen it coming. Story 8. My brother and I used to fight all the time when we were kids. One day, when I was 9 and he was 7, we got into an argument over whose turn it was to play on the family computer. It escalated quickly, with both of us yelling and shoving each other. In the heat of the moment, I grabbed the nearest object, a stapler, and threw it at him as hard as I could. It hit him square in the forehead, leaving a deep gash. Blood started pouring down his face, and he screamed louder than I'd ever heard him scream before. My mom rushed in, panicking when she saw the blood. She took him to the hospital where he ended up needing 6 stitches. I wasn't allowed to visit him and I spent the whole night crying in my room, terrified that he'd hate me forever. To my surprise, when he came home the next day, he didn't seem angry. He just looked at me, smiled and said, "You throw like a girl." It was his way of forgiving me and I've never forgotten that. Story 9. During my freshman year of college, I worked part-time at a fast food restaurant to make ends meet. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. One night, I was working the late shift when a homeless man came in. He didn't have any money but asked if we could spare some food. My manager told him to leave, but I couldn't just ignore him. I waited until my manager wasn't looking, then slipped him a meal from the back. The man thanked me and I thought that was the end of it. But a few days later, he came back, this time with a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked. He handed them to me and said, "Thank you for being kind." That moment stuck with me. It reminded me that even small acts of kindness can mean the world to someone. Story 10. When I was 14, I had a huge crush on a girl in my class. She was smart, funny, and way out of my league. I spent months working up the courage to ask her out, but every time I tried, I chickened out. Finally, on Valentine's Day, I decided to go all out. I bought a bouquet of roses, wrote her a heartfelt note, and left them on her desk before class. I was so nervous that I could barely focus the rest of the day. When she finally found the flowers, she smiled and looked around the room, trying to figure out who they were from. I thought it was my moment, but before I could say anything, one of the popular guys swooped in and claimed the credit. She believed him and they ended up dating for the rest of the year. I never told her the truth, and to this day, I wonder what might have happened if I had just spoken up. Story 11. My dad was a mechanic and he used to let me hang out in the garage while he worked. One day when I was about 10, he gave me a small wrench and told me to help him fix a car. I felt so important, like I was actually contributing. After a while, I got bored and started messing around with some tools on the workbench. I accidentally knocked over a can of oil, spilling it all over the floor. My dad turned around, saw the mess, and got so angry that he yelled at me to leave the garage. I ran off crying, feeling like I had let him down. But later that night he came into my room with a plate of cookies and apologized. He told me that everyone makes mistakes and that I shouldn't be afraid to try again. That moment taught me more about forgiveness and patience than anything else ever has. Story 12. When I was 18, I went on a road trip with my friends to celebrate graduating high school. We were young, reckless, and had no real plan. We just wanted to see where the road would take us. On the third night of our trip, we ended up in the middle of nowhere with no cell service and a nearly empty gas tank. We didn't have enough money for a hotel, so we decided to sleep in the car. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone tapping on the window. It was an older man with a flashlight. He said he was a park ranger and that we couldn't stay there overnight. We explained our situation, and instead of kicking us out, he gave us directions to a nearby campground and even paid our entry fee out of his own pocket. That man's kindness stuck with me. It reminded me that there are good people in the world even when you least expect it. Enjoyed the stories? Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more fun and relatable moments. Your support means the world to me, and I can't wait to bring you even more amazing content. See you in the next one.